Hello. I wanted to do an introduction video to let you know my story and um, the things I've done to get to this point. I have a somewhat typical story in our society in that I was very healthy and very athletic until I was 38 years old, and then I got very sick. And it was, chronic pain, chronic fatigue. I was allergic to everything, and it was one of these very nebulous illnesses where they couldn't find anything, and I spent years and years trying to figure out what happened to me. And it was a real shock to my life because I was very athletic. I rode my bike everywhere. I hiked. I swam every day. I had done that most of my life. And I went from that to barely being able to move. I was in so much pain. So yeah, I went to all these doctors over the years, and I was diagnosed with chronic fatigue syndrome, fibromyalgia, lupus, and then a whole range of other things that went along with it. And of course, over the years, they gave me more and more prescription medications. And this isn't to trash medicine or science. They were doing the best they could, and it's just that they couldn't find really anything going on to pinpoint why I was in so much pain. And so they did what they do to a lot of people who are in this position these days, and that's just to treat the symptoms. And I just kept moving along trying to cope with it, and it was very difficult and very confusing. And then I'd say about 5 years ago, I really started to decline, and I was in a panic about it because I could just feel that things were getting worse and worse. And of course, they kept increasing medications and adding different diagnoses onto what I already had, and doubling down on other medications. And so I'm taking 8 different prescriptions a day, and it was just awful, and it just kept getting worse. The pills were not helping. So to make a long story short, about a year ago, I had reached my limit, maybe about a year and a half to 2 years now. And I was in such despair that I didn't know how much longer I was going to live, because I figured all these prescriptions would eventually just lead to an overdose, or I just couldn't handle it anymore and I would die from pain. So around this time I went to see a couple of doctors, and the first one told me that I should start doing some very simple exercises, some stretching exercises. And I'd been told this before, but whenever I tried to exercise, it was so painful and so difficult that it just seemed impossible. Or I would do exercises and then, later on I would suffer for it. Then I went to see this other doctor, and he talked to me for about an hour and a half to 2 hours and gave me a really thought out and well-researched opinion about why these immune problems are happening in the first place. And it had a lot to do with being hyper-competitive and not giving yourself time to relax and do nothing. And of course, I'm paraphrasing. It was much more complicated than that, and he gave me a lot of things to read, which I did. But basically, he was telling me to chill out, and so I was in so much pain. I was taking so many medications. I was starting to go into convulsions from these medications, and I just thought, okay, I have to try something. And so I did. I began to do these stretching exercises from the first doctor, and then I began to take the information the second doctor gave me to heart, and I began to change an awareness of how I went through the day and what was going on in my mind and how I was competing with myself or competing with society and pushing myself to do 10 different things, many of which were unnecessary. So the two together were basically doing yoga and meditation. And I just kept doing it every day. And little by little, I began to feel this very subtle change going on. And it was like it was chipping away at all this pain inside of me and all this disruption that had occurred. And it was so subtle at first, but I just kept doing it every day. I would do these very simple stretching exercises, and then I would take time every day to just stop and do nothing and think about what I was doing in the first place and why I was doing it and what was my motivation for doing it. And those two things over the course of a year really made a huge difference. So I went from 8 medications a day to none. And the only thing I do now is that the pollution is so bad here in the eastern United States that I get I get asthma. So I still have to take an inhaler during the summer and be careful with that. But all those other things that they had given me, I stopped taking. And of course, I had told the doctors I was doing this. The primary care specialists were a little wary about me doing it. They didn't think it was such a great idea. But the specialist I went to see basically said, well, you can always go back on them. But it's been a year now, and I have maintained this daily routine of stretching and yoga and meditation. And it, I'm not proselytizing here, and this is just my own personal story. And I'm certainly not fundamentalist about it. But it really made a difference to me. And I began to feel again. That's the best way I can describe it. I began to have emotional feelings, and I began to feel my body again. And as this occurred, it was like a huge benefit because the pain began to push back and my feelings began to move forward. And it really made a huge difference, and it allowed me some space to once again be in my body. And then along with that, I did 2 other things. I changed my diet, and I stopped eating all sugar, and I moved towards a much more vegetarian diet. And again, I try not to be fundamentalist or evangelical about this. If during the course of the month I want a piece of chocolate, I will go get one. Or if I am craving some fish, I will have some. But for the most part, like 95 or more % of the time, I try to stay off of all sugar, and I try to eat a mostly vegetarian diet. And the sugar part was really interesting as far as mental capacity and changes in my thinking. First of all, I had these really angry cravings for sugar for about 2 months. And then I began to feel this clarity in my mind, which was a complete change from before. And whether that was doing the yoga and the meditation, mixed with removing the sugar, I don't know, but that's what happened. And then as far as cooking goes, I always check boxes because what's on the front is not what's on the back, and I check the ingredients. Simple is better. The less ingredients, the better. But then I cook for myself also. I buy fresh foods and I cook this stuff for myself. So that is a really nice process too. And it allows me to pay attention to exactly what I'm eating and how it's made, rather than just running out and getting something that's packaged or in a can. This once again allows me a little bit of control over what's going in my body. And it's made such a remarkable difference. I just thought I would begin to share this because I think that as we get older, Uh, we're faced with various things that younger people are not, with our bodies, but also with how we cope with the stress of that. And I think this clenching up and, the pain can get so bad. It's like, just make it stop, whatever, just make it stop. That begins a cycle. And I think for me, and again, I'm not some yoga master or, I'm not an expert at this, but for me, doing the meditation and the yoga and changing my diet just allowed me that space to break that cycle. And so I wanted to share that. And I thought, well, this might be a really good conversation to have too for people who are getting older and see what you're doing. And I know that many of us have had these very nebulous immune problems. And because I've met many people and I've talked to many people online who, one day you're fine and the next day you're not. And then nobody can figure out what happened to you. And I thought through a discussion of yoga, and you could call it whatever you want, you could call it stretching or, whatever you call it, that's fine. And then meditation too. I mean, if I'm certainly not promoting a religious idea here in any way, I'm just saying that we live in a culture that is hyper competitive and pushes us to succeed. And then once we succeed, it has to be that we have to then succeed at 10 more things, in order to keep up. And I think that this stopping and doing nothing is an important conversation, especially as we get older. It's a time to contemplate our successes rather than trying to double down on them. So yeah, that's why I'm going to do this channel, and I will show you the stretches that I've done, some of the thoughts that I've had while doing this, some of the fears I had in beginning this process, and I hope you join in the conversation.